So good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to the second webinar in our COVID-19 management webinar series. This is going to be focused on testing and vaccinations and what your business needs to know to be prepared. My name is Dean Young. I'm the Vice President of Industrial Development. I work with GENEDGE. We are, for those of you who aren't familiar with GENEDGE, I think most of the people I'm looking at on here probably know us, but for any of those who aren't familiar with GENEDGE, we are Virginia's best public resource for helping manufacturing, engineering, and technology businesses innovate, compete, and grow. And what that means is we're really an economic development agency, really focused on economic development for the Commonwealth. We are a political subdivision of the Commonwealth and also affiliated with a federal program called the NIST MEP National Network, which has been one of our primary funding sources since the beginning of our work in 1994. That national network allows us to have a broad reach with a lot of different kinds of resources that we can pull in to help companies, both in the areas of management consulting and also technology transfer to help improve the core competencies of those companies that we serve in the state and ultimately, as we said, try to drive economic growth. We don't do it all alone. We have an extensive network of providers. We have about 30 direct employees. Folks like myself and April that you're going to hear from in a minute. We do have a series of what we call practice management resources organized around particular subject matter. You can kind of see that, but typically we engage first with some sort of an assessment process, try to help a company understand where their gaps are, and then we bring in those resources as we need to try to help them figure out how to get further into their growth strategy. We do this regionally, so you can see kind of in the background here, the way we divide the state up, there are 9 planning regions that are aligned with the Go Virginia economic development structure, if you're familiar with that. And really, we have a team of folks on the ground as well. And so we kind of work in a little bit of a matrix organization where we have regional resources located within the region locally to help companies really manage their growth over time. And then we've got subject matter experts that we pull on in the various pipes of information that we might want to be able to use to help those companies get better. And so really what we're focused on is driving results for the companies that we serve so that they can help find ways to grow ultimately revenues and jobs for the Commonwealth. As I said, this is part 2 of our series. For those of you who joined us on Tuesday, we had a great session with Hunter and Stephen, and I'm looking forward to another great one today. Part 1, we focused a little bit on the standard itself and provided some updates on various aspects that companies needed to be worried about, particularly around the workforce issues. In this part 2, we're going to talk about issues related to rapid testing and talk about things like vaccination policies. So this session will also have some Q&A at the end, so hopefully we'll get through the content and I'll stop talking and turn it over to the experts and let them give you the real content of why you're here. I'm going to turn it over first to our practice manager for organizational development, April Schmidt. She's really driving this, and she's our resident expert, if you will, on all things COVID and COVID management as we roll this out. So, April, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. So glad that you're able to join us. I also want to say, I know there's probably questions about will you receive a recording of this and will you get a copy of the slides? And the answer to that burning question is yes, you will. Hopefully that will be sent to you later this afternoon or tomorrow so that you'll have this material for a reference. There will also be a short poll at the end that will ask if you can take 30 seconds to answer those questions. That will really help us out in our planning as we move forward with what additional resources we might be able to provide to you to help you with being compliant with the permanent standard. I have the distinguished honor of being able to introduce Hunter Byrnes and Stephen Gould, who are our presenters today. They own Byrnes and Gould Law Firm down in Danville, Virginia. They have over 30 years of combined diverse legal experience with an emphasis on business and corporate law, employment law, and litigation, counseling, training, and analysis. And with that, I will turn this presentation over to Hunter and Stephen to be able to help educate us on testing and vaccination.
Thanks so much, April. It's great to be back with everyone again this morning. And if where you're watching from is anything like Danville, it's cold and wet and probably a little icy. So we appreciate everybody hopping on. We are going to really follow a pretty similar approach to what we did on Tuesday, running through a fairly significant amount of content with you and really making sure that we're providing as much as we can in an easily digestible way for you, and hopefully with some practical takeaways. April mentioned just a little bit about our firm, so I'm going to not dwell on that slide. We do want to start the presentation with the disclaimer that we typically use for all of our presentations. And if you were on Tuesday, you heard it and you saw our good friend Saul Goodman from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. And really, this is just a statement to indicate that our discussion today is intended as a general discussion of the subject matter that we're addressing. It's not intended to be comprehensive or to constitute legal advice. So rather than relying on this as legal advice, you should consult with your individual attorney as we are just providing this presentation, and there's not an attorney-client relationship between our firm and anyone participating in this webinar. Quick overview of what we're going to discuss today. We'll give you a quick recap of what we discussed on Tuesday, just a brief refresher there. Then we'll jump into what you should know about rapid testing in the workplace, at least what we know now, followed by some considerations as vaccinations become more and more available. Some of this, we're looking at options that are, practically speaking, going to be a little more relevant months down the line when vaccinations are more widely available, but we want to go ahead and flag some of these things so that you can begin thinking about them if you haven't already. Then we'll give you a preview of part 3 of our series, which is scheduled for next Wednesday at 11, followed by time for brief Q&A as the time will allow. Now for a quick recap of what we talked about on Tuesday. First, we sketched out just a few updates on the federal side for COVID-related legislation. First was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And again, for a full discussion, we'd encourage you to refer back to Tuesday's presentation, and we're just going to hit the highlights here. This program was initially only authorized through the end of 2020, through December 31st, 2020. At the end of the year, Congress did extend it to run through the end of the first quarter of 2021, but participation is voluntary now for employers. If an employer decides that it wants to continue offering the paid leave that Families First authorized, it can do so and will continue to receive a payroll tax credit. But if the employer says, look, we're just not in a place to be able to do that, there is no repercussion for the employer making that decision. Well, one important item that we do want to touch on again is that by virtue of extending the program through the first quarter of 2021, Congress did not authorize any additional leave on top of what the original act provided. So let's say one of your employees has already received the 80 hours of paid leave that Families First authorized. If that employee comes to you and requests additional leave, paid leave under Families First, even if you are participating in the program, you do not have to provide anything to that employee, and even if you did provide paid leave, you would not be able to get the payroll tax credit because it would be a benefit that goes above and beyond what Families First provided for. The Paycheck Protection Program is probably something that most of you are familiar with. Businesses can apply for first or second loans under the PPP. For those businesses that are applying for a second loan, that applied for a first loan last year and are coming back for a second loan, you should know that eligibility is tightened. The size of the businesses that are eligible for those grants is a smaller universe. The amount that can be borrowed has gone down, and also the businesses are going to have to demonstrate with much more particularity and much more detail the need that they have for these second loans. The program has moved beyond the general economic uncertainty that was the qualifying criterion last year. So we recommend making decisions about whether to apply for PPP funding, particularly these second loans. Recommend making those decisions in consultation or in conjunction with your accountant, as while there are legal aspects of this is really a numbers decision that needs to be justified, and something that your accountant is going to be in a very good position to help provide counsel on. We spent the bulk of Tuesday talking about the permanent workforce safety and health standards for COVID-19 that Virginia has adopted. The temporary standard went into place last July, and as of the end of January, the standard has become permanent, and it is in effect at least through the end of the current declaration of emergency that Governor Northam has signed. The permanent standard, like the temporary standard, is a mix of requirements that apply to all employers, plus requirements that are specific to the risk level of different positions within your organization. Most jobs in the manufacturing context are going to be the medium risk, but again, the requirements under the standards dictate that employers do an assessment of all of the positions to make sure that the appropriate risk level is assigned, and that the precautions that correspond to that risk level are taken into account. There are March 26 deadlines under this permanent standard for employee training and response plan development. These are the same training and response plans that the temporary standard called for, but you'll want to make sure that you are providing that training and also developing a response plan going forward under the permanent standard. One thing that we did highlight on Tuesday is that the standard is written in layman's terms, and it's done that way to help businesses achieve widespread compliance quickly without having to go to the time and expense of hiring counsel and taking too much time away from their underlying businesses. The presentation that we gave on Tuesday included cites to the specific provisions in that permanent standard, so that you can track as you're going through the presentation, you can track the part of the standard that we have referenced, so that you can understand exactly what it is that your business needs to do. There are a number of free resources available, both from the state, from GENEDGE, from trade associations, so you don't need to reinvent the wheel here, and certainly would encourage you to take advantage of the resources that are available. The presentation on Tuesday also highlighted a number of key changes between the temporary and permanent standards. So it was not comprehensive, but it flagged a number of the key changes. So would encourage you to refer back to that presentation. Last but not least, with both the federal and state COVID-19 considerations that your organization has, just a reminder that these decisions are not ones that you can make in a vacuum. When you're complying with Families First, when you're complying with the Virginia's permanent standards, the decisions that you make there are not made in a vacuum, and you have to consider the intersection of other federal and state laws with the decisions that you're making, things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, Family Medical Leave Act, Title VII, et cetera. These are things that it often does make sense to talk with the counsel, legal counsel for your organization, just to make sure you're understanding some of the nuances that are at play here. Now we're going to, with that overview behind us, going to jump into the discussion of today's topics. First up is testing, and Hunter will take us through that.
Thank you, Stephen. And the topics we have today, rapid testing and vaccinations, have been two of the most asked questions that we've received over the past month. More so on the vaccination questions, which Stephen will be handling in a little while, than the rapid testing. But there's a lot of confusion over rapid testing and vaccinations as to what employers can and should do and what the implications are for both. So I'm going to start with the rapid testing, and I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the different types of COVID tests. When people say, have you been tested? It really depends what kind of test you've received as to the specificity and accuracy of that test. And so there are two general categories, the molecular tests and the antigen tests. And for the most part, what I'm focused on, my guidance is going to be focused on those molecular tests, because those are the more accurate tests. Those include what you might have heard as PCR tests or RNA tests. Those are both molecular, and they give a far higher degree of accuracy. The last number that I saw was above 94% accurate. Whereas the antigen test I've seen as low as 60% accurate. So there's a wide gap there. So really, you need to know that first and foremost, what types of tests are you dealing with, because we would not recommend doing widespread rapid testing on an antigen basis for your workforce, simply because it is going to eliminate a lot of people and it's going to miss a lot of people that are positive. So you really don't want either of those to happen for the continuity and consistency of your business. So focus on those molecular tests. Now, getting into the meat of what we're going to talk about, what can you do? Well, the simplest answer is you can require testing of your workforce. That's the simple answer. The sub reference to that is as long as it is in a non-discriminatory manner. You need to follow the guidance of the EEOC, which means that you have to you need to exercise appropriate care with the protected health information. A lot of times you'll hear a PHI. Sometimes you'll just hear it referred to as HIPAA. Well, HIPAA is not exactly the same thing, but nonetheless, what they're talking about is that protected health information that you receive from somebody. As an employer, you cannot disseminate that information. You need to keep it confidential and share it only with that employee, unless that employee releases it to the public, him or herself. And you need to allow employees to decline the testing if they have valid health reasons or on account of a deeply held religious belief. And again, that's tying into both the ADA and Title VII. So the EEOC normally is very conservative in what it allows employers to do, which could possibly infringe upon an employee's rights. And so it was kind of surprising that they came out and specifically gave the guidance that yes, in a circumstance like this, an employer can require testing of their employees so long as it's job related and the testing is accurate and reliable. So that's obviously your hope, is that you're doing that. And why would you go through the extra cost of testing people if it were not job related? So you're probably going to meet both of those criteria. How do you do it? How do you handle your rapid testing of all of these employees? Well, you've really got two options, or the combination of those two options. One is you can actually offer testing on site. You can send them to a testing facility off site, or you can do a mix of the two, so that you're sending a portion of your folks off site. And for those that, maybe it's easier for you to handle a subsection of your employees on site. If you're requiring the testing of your employees must not be forced to pay for it. So do not forget that when you're formulating your policy on testing, you've got to pay for all these tests. Sometimes the government's going to make them available to you at no charge. Sometimes they're not. If you're using an outside testing facility, you're going to have to pay for that. So you need to factor that into your budget and the pros and cons, the cost benefit analysis yourself, based on, you know, obviously the size of your workforce and the need for it in your workforce. You know, a lot of folks, that are outside of the manufacturing realm are doing a lot of remote, work. And so, companies are not finding it necessary to do the testing of their employees because those employees are working by themselves in their own homes. So you've got multiple options for carrying out the testing. There are mobile testing companies that will actually set up shop on your premises and do all the testing there for you. You can work with a physician group or physician testing lab to handle it so that you're sending them through that offsite facility. And then you can handle internally, but you must follow the proper, you must follow the correct protocols. We recommend for all of you out there that you touch base with a representative from GENEDGE. They've got a lot of bandwidth to help you in this process if you decide you want to handle on-site testing, and they can help you through the process. There are others that you can contact as well. We're just very familiar that GENEDGE has been on the forefront of getting this knowledge and being proactive about sharing it with their customers. So, you know, we are lawyers, so we always have to touch on what can you not do? Well, we mentioned earlier discrimination. You cannot test some of your employees and not test other of your employees because it might be viewed as discriminatory. So your policy needs to either address all of your on-site workers. I mean, you can break them up into categories like we're testing all of our on-site workers and we're not testing remote workers. That makes sense. But you can't say we're only testing women or we're only testing men, things of that nature. It must be administered consistently and for a job-related reason. I already mentioned that before. These tests, screenings, and inquiries about COVID, they must be necessary to address the potential direct threat posed by COVID-19. You can't ask a lot of random questions along with the COVID inquiries that might be viewed for any other reason other than we need the answer to this because of the direct threat posed by COVID-19. And again, I'm going to hit this again. You cannot release this testing information to anybody else. These results must remain confidential, especially the names of those who have tested positive. You know, we've seen PR releases that have said, you know, Bob Jones and whatever department tested positive, and you just kind of go, holy cow, you're not allowed to do that. For those of you out there that are sports fans, early on, teams were actually releasing the names of some of their players who had tested positive. That stopped pretty quickly with the NFL, the NBA, et cetera, et cetera. So now that you don't see those names unless the player himself or herself comes out and says, I tested positive, in which case that employee can always release their own confidential information, but be very cognizant of that and make sure that only those who need to know are given the name of the person that tested positive, because you don't want somebody to just blab it outside. Or post it on their social media or something along those lines where it goes viral. I think I just skipped a slide. I did this last time as well. I did. Okay, so the question you need to be asking yourself is rapid testing an effective tool for my business? And you need to be cognizant of both the pros and the cons to the widespread testing, the things that you can do, the things that you can't do, and what those implicate. Now, from a cost perspective, if you participate, that's actually from a different part. That's from the FFCRA. So exclude that. The pros includes you're going to get a safer workplace and workforce. Now, you might inadvertently have a false positive, and so you're taking somebody out of the workplace that didn't need to be out of the workplace. But again, if you're using the highly accurate molecular-based form of testing, then that's going to be a very, very small number. And you will also be helping to prevent the spread so that somebody who was asymptomatic might find out that they're actually positive, and then they go they're out of the market for a couple of weeks. So hopefully they're not spreading it among your workforce or their friends and family. The cons, you need to look at the potential costs that you're going to incur by paying for all of these tests for any of those that are not covered by a state or government agency. And again, there are options out there, but they're not all free of cost. As I mentioned, you do need to consider the false positives that are out there that are going to rule people out of work, that, you know, they might be essential workers that you're going to lose, or they're going to have to work remotely in a less productive way. You've got your issues involving HIPAA and protected health information, the ADA, that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Title VII discrimination issues, which we mentioned earlier. One that we hear probably more than anything else is the potentially negative employee morale issue. That's one that we can't really give you a lot of good advice on it because it's based upon your knowledge of your workforce and you feeling out what is going to be the reaction. Stephen's going to hit this as well when he talks about vaccinations, but most people do not have nearly the negative reaction to being tested as we've seen from potential mandatory vaccination policy. So for the most part with the testing, you're not going to get a lot of negative reactions. Most people understand that you're trying to protect the workforce and prevent the spread. And heck, most people want to know, am I positive? Because with the high numbers of asymptomatic positive tests that are out there, it's always good to know that you could possibly be carrying this virus and spreading it even though you feel great. All right, well, I'm going to pass it on to Stephen now to talk about vaccinations, and hopefully we'll have some time if you have questions about testing at the end. Stephen?
Sorry, I had a heavy finger there and skipped over Hunter's last slide.
Okay, well, I thought I'd made the mistake. Well, there we go. The ADA issues and additional employment concerns. Remember, the EEOC allows testing so long as not done in a discriminatory manner, but with the ADA considerations, some employees have disabilities that may prohibit testing. You know, if this comes up and they've got a pre-existing disability or they have a note from a doctor explaining why they should not be tested, you need to listen, stop, and then you need to provide an alternative testing option. That's specifically what they say is if somebody says they can't do your testing, you've got to provide an alternative testing option for that person that meets their doctor's guidance. If somebody, for whatever reason, brings up a Title VII consideration, and it's a legitimate one, you need to listen and you need to make sure that you do not infringe upon their religion, sex, or other protected class rights. Now, normally with testing, Title VII should not be implicated, but it underscores the importance of the consistency of your testing, your policy. You might still get a complaint, but so long as you've applied these tests equally and fairly and consistently, you've got an extremely strong defense. Nobody wants to talk about actually defending a complaint, but it will probably stop any complaint from being filed as so long as everybody is subject to the same testing requirements. Now, we will pass it on to Stephen.
Thank you. As we get into the question of vaccinations and what your business should or should not require, you're going to see a fair amount of overlap with what we just discussed, with what Hunter just walked you through on testing. A lot of the issues that we are flagging for you, a number of the considerations, there is considerable overlap here. So what you will find is that whether it is the testing issue or the vaccination issue, a number of the things that should be going through your mind as an employer are going to be either substantially similar or the same. So let's start off with the potential for a mandatory policy in your organization. Much like with testing, the EEOC allows employers to have a mandatory vaccination policy so long as it's non-discriminatory. It allows for exceptions under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Title VII, and it's done to prevent harm to the employee and to others. Mandatory vaccinations must be provided at no cost to employees. So much like the testing, if you are going to insist on vaccinations for members of your team, that's going to be a cost that you bear to the extent that there's a cost, not one that you're passing along to your employees or expecting them to cover. Practically speaking, employees have to have access to vaccinations in order for this to be an immediate question that your organization has to deal with. In most circumstances, that is going to be a problem. If you're hoping to have mandatory vaccination policy now, you're likely not going to be able to move ahead with that because of scarcity of vaccinations. We're seeing more and more becoming available, but it's not as if anyone can roll down to the neighborhood CVS and get a vaccination. And also the priority list that the state has put into place. Availability is going to remain an issue at least for the near term, for those who aren't frontline or healthcare workers, and that's understandable. There are certain categories of folks that need to be vaccinated before others, and that's not to say that we won't be into the next category soon, but if you want to have a mandatory vaccination policy tomorrow and you are not on the front lines of helping to support folks during the time of COVID, or you don't have a healthcare focused business, it's likely not going to be something that can become a reality for you, at least at this point. Optional vaccination policies are what will probably be the norm for most organizations going forward. It is the preferred approach at present, given vaccine availability. Now, if vaccines were available to all employers, maybe a different situation, but most employers do not have or do not foresee in the immediate future the availability of vaccines being widespread enough that they can go with a mandatory policy. So optional is what we're seeing. One benefit of having an optional policy is that it frees employers from liability issues or concerns with respect to any reactions that folks may have to the vaccine or potential claims of discrimination. The most surefire way to avoid any potential liability is to not require the vaccine to be administered to your folks, and so you're not having to worry about liability if this is going to be an optional thing for you. Employers can still encourage vaccination for their employees, and they have considerable flexibility with how they go about that. They can offer incentives for employees to receive vaccinations. One of the things that you may have heard on the news is that Target is offering a certain number of hours of pay to their employees who receive the vaccine. They're also offering free rides with the Lyft rideshare program you may want to talk with your accountant or with your legal counsel to the extent that you are moving beyond anything other than straight payment of wages here as an incentive, just to make sure that you are accounting for any tax liability that the benefits will create for you or for your employees, and just to make sure that nothing could be construed as running afoul of the law, particularly if you're offering a menu of incentives for certain groups but not for others too. To receive the vaccine.
One other suggestion, sorry to jump in, but one other suggestion that some employers are utilizing is additional time off. And that could be a way that you're giving them a nice perk that you don't have to actually give them money. Obviously, time is money and you're giving them extra time. But I've also heard of people giving an extra day or 2 days for those employees who are vaccinated, and you can pick when they can use those days. You could put them off until fourth quarter of this year or even next year if you want to. But try to be creative and find ways to incentivize your workforce to get vaccinated as soon as they can, because as Stephen mentioned, for some of them, they might love to get vaccinated, but it's not even available to them at this time. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. And I know, do you want to mention the benefit that you heard this past weekend?
Sure. I'll proudly tell you, I was actually fortunate to get vaccinated this past weekend. And one of the people that was there was bragging about he's excited because in a month he'll get his second dose and he'll be able to get his $250 bonus from a local company here. And according to him, everybody there was going to get vaccinated because they wanted that bonus. And so it just made perfect sense to me that it's something that it's going to protect you as the employer, because the more people are vaccinated, the more they're going to actually be at work and be productive, et cetera, et cetera. So,
and one thing for you to just keep in mind from a practical standpoint, if you are considering extra wages for your employees, there may be things that motivate your salaried exempt employees that would not be or that motivate your hourly employees that don't motivate your salaried exempt folks. So if you're talking about extra hourly wages, things, or you know, a lump sum that's perhaps not as generous as $250, that may motivate some folks. You know, time off or something else may motivate some other folks, like your salaried exempt folks. So you may need to have a little bit of creativity, as Hunter said, with how you're going about that. As long as you're still providing options that are going to be non-discriminatory, you should be in good shape there. I want to talk a little bit about some of the liability and morale considerations that are involved with vaccination policies. And up front, I just want to let everyone know, at this point, we are in a position where we are left to speculate and make educated guesses about a number of these things, particularly on the liability front. The potential for employer liability related to mandatory vaccinations is an unanswered question at this point. This obviously is the first pandemic that we have dealt with in our lives, and we have a situation where the policy and legal infrastructure in place, while robust and ready to tackle a number of issues, discrimination, reasonable accommodations, and so on and so on. The system was not built with something like a pandemic in mind. So we're going to be playing considerable catch up in the future as we come out of these uncharted waters. But let us tell you what our expectation is. Our expectation is that employers, if they go with a mandatory vaccination policy, they would not be held liable for individual reactions to the vaccine, and that any claims that might arise here would be the purview of workers' compensation, because this would be a work-related injury. If you're requiring the vaccination, it's going to be for work, even if it's not happening on site. It's going to be within that nexus of work duties and should fall under workers' compensation. Now, that said, and you love the lawyer saying, that said, nothing has been litigated. So again, there's no real precedent for this kind of situation. We expect that we will begin to see at least some discussion, if not some case law coming down the pike in the future. But right now, we're just in educated guess territory. We will say the most frequent complaint we have heard from employers with whom we've talked about a mandatory vaccination policy is the effect on employee morale. You might get a little pushback on the testing front. You start talking about mandatory vaccination, potential for pushback is going to be considerably higher, and that is likely to vary based on where you are in the state. Pockets of skepticism about the vaccine are probably going to be a little more concentrated in some areas rather than others. So you've got to know your audience if you're thinking about moving forward in this direction. There certainly is what we've seen, resentment toward employers for being seen as forcing vaccines on employees. Now, there is no civil liberties issue here. The employer-employee relationship is not something that that is going to be governed by concerns that folks have about their rights being infringed. Employers have a lot of latitude with what they're requiring of their employees as long as it's business related. But again, the potential for resentment is real, and it is something that is likely to come up. We've heard concerns from employers that we work with about their employees fearing potential reactions or consequences of vaccination. One thing that has popped up that we've heard is female employees being concerned about potential sterility as a result of vaccination, a general distrust of the science related to the vaccine. And irrespective of whether the concerns that employees have about the vaccine are well-founded, practically speaking, as employers, you're not able to ignore that those concerns exist. It doesn't mean that you can't still insist upon mandatory vaccination policy, but you've got to know what you're getting into. As an employer, if you are considering a mandatory vaccination policy at the right time, you may want to think or talk with your leadership team about how well your folks complied with social distancing and mask requirements, the things that are some of those threshold safety behaviors that we've all tried to adopt and that the Virginia standard, permanent standard, is now enforcing. If you've had folks who have been hesitant or reluctant to comply with some of those things, odds are they're going to push back pretty strongly on mandatory vaccination policy, and you may be dealing with turnover or discipline issues that are going to be disruptive for your organization. So, at the end of the day, as an employer, you're really facing the question of, is it better for my business to require the vaccine? And again, that's going to be based on the type of business that you have and whether it is, whether it makes sense for you based on a variety of factors, or are you in as good, if not a better position by maintaining an optional vaccination policy, possibly with having some incentives available to employees to try to encourage them to take that step of getting vaccinated in the hope of providing additional protection for everyone. Now, the answer is going to depend on a mix of considerations, and those are going to vary based on organization. The nature of your business. Are you interacting more with the public? Are your employees, is it tougher for your employees to space out? do you have the conditions of your workplace? Is it more, do you have more of a recipe for outbreaks or exposure than some of your other colleagues in your industry? You've got to think about the anticipated reaction by your employees. Is this something that is going to cause a lot of headaches with your folks? Is there a chance of you losing good people or having to just deal with some disciplinary issues that right now you would prefer not to? And last but not least, you've got to look at vaccine availability. Right now, there are certainly limitations there. Hopefully, it will become, availability will be much more widespread for a larger swath of the population. But you've got to deal with the reality of what you have now. I'm going to turn it back over to Hunter to bring us home.
Sure, thanks, Stephen. I'm going to try to get through this pretty quickly so that we'll leave some time for questions. But rapid testing of your workforce is permissible so long as it is job-related and accurate and reliable and not applied in a discriminatory manner. And you must allow for the exemptions, the exceptions for people who have valid discriminatory or ADA concerns, and you must keep that protected health information confidential. Like the rapid testing, mandatory vaccination for employees is allowed. I'm not sure if we specifically said this earlier, but the EEOC specifically dictated that employers may have a mandatory vaccination policy with the huge caveat of it's got to be available. You can't require it of your workforce if they can't get it, obviously. And again, it must be non-discriminatory and allow for the appropriate exceptions. You have your optional policies, which can be coupled with incentives. They don't have to be, but they can be coupled with incentives if you really want your workforce vaccinated. These optional policies are probably going to receive a far better reception from your employees, but you know, some employers really need their employees all vaccinated, and morale is one of those things that that is secondary. So for the time being, for most of you that are on this call, the mandatory policy is academic until there is widespread availability. We deal with a lot of healthcare providers, and for them, it's not academic. They, some have gone mandatory and some chose not to. So it's been interesting watching which ones pick which way. And if you're in doubt at all about what the law allows you to do, please just seek your lawyer's guidance.
And if I can add one thing there, Hunter, sure. Particularly if you decide to go the mandatory vaccination route, having an understanding of the exceptions or the exemptions, that's going to be important. And the two big categories there, and these are not exclusive, but these are the two most likely categories. One, folks who are claiming that based on a disability, they're not going to be able to receive the vaccine. You would want to run that person through your reasonable accommodation process. And also folks who have an objection to receiving the vaccine based on their religious beliefs. With both disability and religious beliefs, there are going to be some fairly detailed and involved discussions to be had and processes to be followed. Those are things that if you are not well versed in running through those types of analyses, talking with your lawyer will be a wise use of your time and would more than likely help you to limit potential liability and save expenditures of cost and time that would be incurred if you cut corners and wind up having a complaint filed against you.
That's absolutely right. Thank you, Stephen. So that's going to conclude. Well, I skipped another slide. So use your legal counsel to review policies to ensure the proper handling of the PHI. To assess employee requests for the exceptions and the exemptions that Stephen was just mentioning. Confirming that any potential incentives you might be using, whether it's pay or time off or some other benefit, that they are legal for you to do so and they don't implicate any other issues. And keeping you updated on what's going on from the EOC, the Department of Labor, and any other agency, as there are so many that are coming out with new regulations. So that's going to conclude today's. Next Wednesday, we have our third and final, which for the most part is just going to give a quick recap of today, but really focus in on all of your questions from today and from Tuesday, because as I'm looking at the clock, we're almost out of time again. And so I'm going to pass it on to April at this time, and thank everybody for joining us. If she's there.
I am, maybe.
That you are.
I froze for a second again there. So thank you, Hunter and Stephen, so much for your time today and all the terrific information that you have provided us. I do see there are 2 questions in the chat, and for those individuals, please know that we do see them. I do have them recorded, and that is something that we can look to address next week, Wednesday, when we have our third and final webinar. I know we have just a quick poll that we would like to be able to ask you to complete. And then I think, Dean, you have an additional slide and information that we want to share with everybody who's attending today. So one, if you could complete the poll, and then we'll put up a slide at the end too to let you know about some upcoming webinars and events that we have. I'll go over those as well. All right, so this next Tuesday on February 23rd from 10 until 11, we have someone, Holly Singleton, who's the Assistant Director for OSHA training in North Carolina, who will be doing a webinar for us talking about OSHA guidance. She'll be able to go over questions related to masks, types of masks, disinfecting versus sanitizing will be covered in her content. Then, as Hunter and Stephen mentioned, we'll have part 3 of our COVID webinar series that will go over highlights from webinars 1 and 2, and then be able to address questions that you have. And then we know with all of the information that we have been presenting in these webinars and information contained in the final standard, that you might have some questions about the documents that have been asked or talked about, the infectious disease response plan. So we have a workshop that we are partnering with VMA to be able to offer to you, and we have the link to that workshop listed below, and you can register with them to attend, and that will be again Tuesday, March 9th. Dean, any additional information that I missed?
No, only that I will say again, I'll follow up what April said earlier. We will follow this up with an email with all of the slide content. You'll have links to the recording of this webinar, as well as some resource pages, and I'll provide these links as well in that email for those of you who want to sign up for the follow-on sessions. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for the remainder of the series as we continue to try to put out information that's going to be beneficial to you as you figure out how to manage through this new standard.
And thank you again, everybody, so much for your time today and joining us. We look forward to having you join us next week.